Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar. Thank you for being with us. My name is Ross Gray. I'm Vice President Sales and Marketing at Cloudsoft, and I am delighted you can join us for this webinar on OpenStack. What we have today is a great panel featuring the analyst perspective from Sadowski at 451 Research, provider perspective from Jesse Proudman, CTO, IBM Blue Box, talking about IBM Private Cloud as a Service with OpenStack, and the consumer side from Duncan, Johnston-Watt, founder and chief executive of Cloudsoft, who is going to talk about why IBM Blue Box was the right dedicated cloud choice. Please do ask questions via the chat, and we will take these and answer them at the end. The session is going to be posted on the Cloudsoft YouTube channel. Thank you, and without further ado, over to Sadowski.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome everybody. Appreciate the introduction. So what I am going to do today is talk about OpenStack as an analyst firm, and I am currently the research vice president for infrastructure services. 451 has 15 different channels that we focus on. And my first involvement with OpenStack was when I first started with the company a little over 3 years ago, and our coverage predominantly focused on service providers and distribution providers of OpenStack at that time. Since then, as OpenStack's matured and cloud brokerage and cloud management platforms started adopting OpenStack, our channel there started covering it, and now pretty much all of our channels there is some impact to it because of OpenStack, including even our newest area, the Internet of Things. Now, on an annual basis, myself and another colleague, we publish something called the OpenStack Pulse, and we talk about how the software has evolved since the previous year. There's timely topics always. This year, there's a big focus on containers and how containers and OpenStack work together, how they maybe be competitors in the future, and the potential for something like Kubernetes to actually manage OpenStack or OpenStack managing containers. We continuously track the community growth and the market size and share some enterprise insights from our Voice of the Enterprise. And our 2016 version of the OpenStack Pulse is actually going to get published later this month. And much of the content that I'm going to share today is going to be based on the new report that's coming out. So my plan for the remainder of my time is to first share some insights about the public and private cloud in general, some of the trends and market sizing we're tracking, and then I'll dive in a little deeper to OpenStack specifically and talk about the adoption trends we're seeing, the specific market size we're tracking, share some price analysis, and then just wrap up with a couple of thoughts about pros and cons and summary thoughts. So I'm going to start at a high level, as I said, and talk about some of these cloud adoption trends. So we have something called the Voice of the Enterprise, and we interview and survey enterprises, mostly mid-size and large enterprise, across all different verticals, all different sizes, typically $5 million budgets and higher for IT. And what's interesting is when we ask them how they're evolving their internal infrastructure, the majority are still in the virtualization and automation phase. As much as they aspire to have private cloud be a key component of their IT plans, they are still stuck in virtualization and automation. And the reasons are interesting. When we ask them what are some of the roadblocks for getting to the next phase, so if they were currently doing virtualization, how to get to automation, or from automation to orchestration, etc., 58% cite not IT related issues. So it's not having the budget, not having the time, not having the skilled resources to focus on these initiatives. But also fear and uncertainty and doubt play a big portion of this. So there's IT managers who are worried that they're going to put themselves and their teams out of jobs by adopting cloud capabilities. As far as IT roadblocks, when we asked enterprises specifically about the pain points that were IT related, and we asked them to rank them low, moderate, or significant impact. The results were pretty interesting. 85% of the respondents cited security as being a moderate or significant impact, followed by compliance and regulatory. So they want to make sure that if they were to move their applications and data outside their own on-premise compute and storage, that they're still able to check the box on being compliant and supporting any regulatory issues that their vertical might require. Data sovereignty is a large issue, especially in Europe and Asian markets. The price and the cost to do such is still a concern. And then once they were to turn something up, how to migrate, making sure they have the right skill sets to support it. And then also what happens when they need to do change management. And these are all areas that either an OpenStack project, a distribution provider, or a professional services firm or service provider offering public-private cloud are all looking at these concerns and trying to figure out how they incorporate them into their value proposition. So this pie chart represents the budget allocation for a typical enterprise that we are talking to. And you can see that a third of the costs are staffing related, and another third of the costs are servers, storage, and networking. Cloud services represents roughly 7% of that budget. But when we asked enterprises about that specific area, 54% have planned to increase that budget in 2016 and further. And if we look a little deeper into that cloud services budget, we asked specifically what they're going to spend that hosting and services money on. Now, you would suspect that it would be compute and storage, but actually 70% of that budget is going to be spent on things beyond just compute and storage. They're looking for managed services, application hosting capabilities, and security services as well. They want to be able to secure not only endpoints, but the data either at rest or in motion, and just keeping the bad guys out in general. So for this IT and hosting spend, who will win the race is kind of the thought here. Now, early on, VMware pretty much owned the virtualization space in one of the early private cloud providers. And on the public side, 2006, Amazon introduced its storage and compute capabilities, and fast forward 10 years, it now has a $10 billion run rate, and its revenues are just about equal to the next 203 providers that we track in our market sizing efforts. And its market cap, what it was able to achieve in 10 years, took IBM 100 to do, but things are moving a lot faster in the space. And its main competitors are some of the other hyperscalers, Azure, Google, IBM, to name a few. Alibaba's Aliyun property is big in Asia and is starting to establish a beachhead in North America. And Oracle has made some noise of late, actually looking to go after Amazon, even based on price. Enterprises also cite open source alternatives to these platforms as well. They look at OpenStack and Eucalyptus and CloudStack and OpenNebula were names a couple of years ago of people that cited open source as a driver for replacing some proprietary platforms. Now we've seen Eucalyptus be acquired by HP, mainly looking to provide private cloud to Amazon integration. And early days, CloudStack was the main brand, its main benefactor being Citrix, that most people in the space thought about when they considered an open source alternative to these VMware and Amazon. But over time, CloudStack and OpenNebula have kind of fallen off in terms of mindshare. And OpenStack has kind of filled the void as the de facto standard for a open source cloud alternative platform. So that kind of is a good segue to show the overall market size. So we track bottoms-up estimates from a number of providers. The size of the infrastructure as a service market by 2019 is expected to be 20 billion. Again, Amazon making a large portion of that, but some of its competitors gaining some significant traction. But what's interesting, as much as the hype there is for multi-cloud infrastructure as a service, it's the hosting capabilities, dedicated, shared, managed hosting, that are still growing at double digits and is 6 times larger still. And as I said, the enterprises prefer private cloud to public cloud, and this data shows that. Just in terms of comparison, and we'll get into this a little deeper, the red on this chart represents the overall size of the OpenStack market in comparison. Now, it's not exactly an apples to apples comparison, and I'll explain what we track as part of our OpenStack market size, but still very early days in terms of revenue compared to some of the legacy capabilities that enterprises are looking at. So now I'm going to go in a little deeper now to OpenStack specifically and talk about its adoption and some of the trends that we are seeing internally. And I'll kind of start with this journey. So back in 2010, that's when NASA and Rackspace said, we need to find an alternative to AWS, and they established OpenStack. Over the next year, we see some initial adoption. CERN, the Europe Research Organization, was a major player, a major user, and now has greater than 165,000 cores running on OpenStack. In 2012, this is when I first was exposed to OpenStack. I was a telco, working for a telco, and had cloud strategy responsibility, and we spoke to Rackspace about its capabilities, and at the time it was not ready for service providers. But 2012 was a pivotal year for OpenStack because that is when Rackspace decided to turn it over to Apache, and that foundation was formed. And in my opinion, if Citrix had done similar prior, that we'd be talking about CloudStack a lot more. The fact that OpenStack built the foundation and gave its supporters the ability to provide money and resources for marketing and development helped snowball the adoption of OpenStack, and I'll get into that a little later. In 2013, that's when we start to see some of the international adoption. The foundation had its summit in Hong Kong for the first time, and now Asia is one of the fastest growing areas for OpenStack, and Beijing and Shanghai are two of the top cities as far as developers for OpenStack go. Over the next 2 years, you can see now the growth of the community, and you start to see logos that your kids recognize as adopters of OpenStack. Category leaders for pretty much every vertical now has an OpenStack user. In fact, the top deployments now include Comcast and Walmart, in addition to CERN, Snapdeal, PayPal, and Verizon round out the top users. And the most recent release of OpenStack this past April, the summit was held back in Austin again. The first ever summit had 75 people, and the most recent one had over 7,500 people. So clearly, there's the one probably takeaway in a word, I would say momentum. So if you're familiar with NASCAR, cars race around the track trying to be first, and they're covered in advertising. If you're on from Europe, you can replace this car with a Formula One race car, and basically the same thing. They're rolling advertisements. And in my opinion, the fact that the foundation was formed and gave major IT companies the opportunity to put their name on a NASCAR slide that was for OpenStack really caused the growth of OpenStack and was a catalyst for enterprise adoption. And this chart represents the financial supporters over time, and there's now over 600 different supporters. And if you name the major IT vendor, IBM and Cisco and HP and Dell, Intel, Juniper, Oracle, even VMware and Citrix are now supporting the OpenStack Foundation. And it's typically one of the top 2 or 3 reasons that a enterprise cites an interest in OpenStack is the fact that these major IT titans are all supporting. So we have something called the Voice of the Enterprise. We collect enterprise demand trends, and we asked enterprises what their organization's implementation status for OpenStack was. And across these users, there was, these were the results. So 42% either have a application deployed on OpenStack, or it's in pilot or are planning to, and that 58% have no plans. But this was from across all users, not specifically those that have adopted cloud. And we see this adoption growing as far as in use over time as well. And when we asked to describe their spending plans specifically for OpenStack, so across all of those enterprises that were doing OpenStack, 58% are going to keep their budget the same, and nearly 40% are planning to increase. So what this shows is there is interest, but there's also some concerns with it, and I'll get into what some of those concerns with OpenStack are in just a little bit. And then as far as who they're going to buy from, there's a number of different ways you can consume OpenStack. You can use a distribution. You can get it from a service provider. You can actually go out and download the code yourself and do it. And then other includes things like using OpenStack as in a SaaS model, or perhaps it is a converged platform that includes the hardware and the software. But the distro was the predominant choice, followed by service provider. And what were some of the decision criteria that helped them decide on which distribution provider to use or which service provider to use? Cost was obviously an important factor, but the vendor's ability to provide long-term support. If you go back to the early days of OpenStack, there were some major players that now don't even exist that may have offered something that even included some proprietary capabilities, and that bit some folks. So they're looking for well-established organizations. Oftentimes, existing relationship is part of the decision criteria. If it was a Red Hat enterprise Linux shop, they may go down the OpenStack trail with Red Hat's OpenStack distribution. If they're an existing VMware shop, VMware's VIO is actually something that they can consider. And if they're already doing professional services or managed services with IBM, then oftentimes IBM will be the choice they will go with. And then reputation and community. This is why a lot of distro providers and service providers cite the number of project team leaders they have, the number of board seats they have, or the number of code contributions they've provided in order to show how they differentiate in the marketplace as well. And having a one-stop shop is important as well, being able to source hardware, software, professional services, everything from the same source. So now I'm going to move over to the OpenStack market size. This is something actually that's something unique that 451 does. We have something called the OpenStack Market Monitor. We do this for a number of different spaces. I shared the overall hosting and cloud space earlier. When we talk about the OpenStack market size, what's in scope is probably just as important as what's out of scope. So service providers, either providing public cloud, private cloud, it might be a distribution provider. It could be all that consulting and training and management functions as well. But what we don't include is the revenue that like PayPal or eBay or Walmart might be receiving because of their OpenStack-based infrastructure. We don't include any of that. And out of scope, if somebody buys server, storage, or networking hardware from one of the major vendors, or white box solution providers, we don't include that hardware specifically. A lot of those hardware providers don't often know what venue that deployment is going to, or at least they don't have the ability to track a SKU specifically with that granularity. And then we don't include revenue generated by enterprises, as I mentioned before. So how big is this market? So we break it up into service providers and products, distros, and as of this year, we actually broke out private and public cloud specifically, and we expect OpenStack specific revenues to grow to 5.7 billion by 2012. The majority of this revenue is service provider. Distros are an increasingly large portion of that. In fact, we actually expect that private cloud share of the service provider revenue to grow from 25 to 40% by 2012. Okay, the last section that I'm going to share before getting into some final thoughts is some analysis that we did around the cost of ownership. So we have something called the Cloud Price Index. We sent out a spec to service providers and distros and asked them to respond to basically an RFP. We wanted 500 virtual machines on 25 servers, and we wanted you to include all the space, power, firewall, everything you need to run a private cloud with these basic specs. And it was interesting what we got back. So we compared a distribution to doing a DIY solution. Now you would naturally expect that if you have the same infrastructure and the same software and the same number of engineers, that the OpenStack distribution is going to be more expensive because you're paying for licensing costs or support costs. But what the data showed was pretty interesting. In fact, that if you were able to repurpose 45% of those engineers, so take them off the project and leverage the distribution and the vendor supporting that distribution, that actually the distro was actually a better value proposition for an enterprise. We also compared it to managed private cloud versus self-managed. And what we found was you would naturally think that managed services was going to be more expensive than doing self-managed. But what the data shows there is that depending on the number of virtual machines that each engineer is supporting will determine whether or not which option is better. In fact, managed services would be a better TCO if an engineer had to support less than 100 virtual machines each. So to kind of wrap up with some pros and cons and just some summary thoughts. So enterprises are interested in OpenStack, it's clear, and they cite a number of reasons why. So they want to avoid vendor lock-in. Open source is kind of tricky that way because at some point you do have to pick a solution, but the enterprises do cite vendor lock-in as a reason for gravitating towards OpenStack. They like the modularity. There's no central controller. If somebody just wanted to use OpenStack Swift for object storage, they could, or if they wanted to deploy an OpenStack solution and not use Neutron, there's plugins that are available. Open source is increasingly a mandate across enterprises. In fact, there's some agencies within the UK government that now even have open source mandates. I talked about the cost savings versus alternatives, and I also mentioned earlier about the major vendors backing the community. This is a major momentum builder for OpenStack over time. The fact that you're not locked into ESX or Hyper-V, if you don't want to use KVM, you don't have to. The fact that it supports multiple hypervisors is of interest to enterprises. And finally, for those largest of enterprises that run their own networks or the telcos across the globe, network function virtualization is a hot and growing use case for OpenStack. But OpenStack's not without concerns as well, and enterprises cite a number. There is limited interest from the SMB market. They just don't have the skills and resources to try to build their own OpenStack, and they often turn to SaaS solutions for applications. And if you were to compare OpenStack out of the box to VMware, it still lacks reliability and resiliency, HA and vMotion, all those capabilities that VMware has. Are still lacking. And the fact that it's still a toolkit rather than a product is a concern for some. If you dumped a big giant pile of Legos on a table and asked two kids to build a house, you would get two very different looking houses. And that's the same thing with OpenStack. You can ask two different service providers to build an enterprise, or you ask two enterprises to go and build a private cloud with the OpenStack projects, and you would likely get two very different looking solutions. There's still concern with fragmentation, kind of the Unix and Linux scenario, but the governance for OpenStack likely prevents that from happening, but it's still a concern. And as I mentioned, it's complex to deploy, and that's been the knock for quite some time. Even the upgrade process is a concern for a number of folks. The fact that there's a new release every 6 months, and how do they go and test that and upgrade it when they're used to purchasing software and having it run for a number of years. The other big concern for OpenStack is just the shortage of skilled labor. When we do our TCO analysis, the OpenStack developer, an engineer, actually comes at a 40% premium over some of the alternatives. And then to just kind of summarize, so as I mentioned, enterprises, they prefer private cloud to public cloud, and regardless of the choice, security is still the biggest issue for them. And while OpenStack is starting to get enterprise mindshare, the wallet share is still in early days, but clearly growing. As I mentioned, getting over 5 billion by 2012. But there's clearly still a lot of work. The releases going forward need to address a lot of those enterprise issues with operating at scale, for example, and providing that resiliency out of the box. Clearly, the distributions have TCO savings, especially when you can reduce manpower. And then when enterprises are selecting a partner to move forward with OpenStack, the vendor relationship is pretty much a major key for that. So that was my insights. I thank you for listening, and I'll turn it back.
Thank you very much, Al. Excellent overview and very insightful. I will now hand you over to the very capable hands of Jesse Proudman to talk us through from the perspective of IBM Blue Box. Jesse.
Great, thank you. Get the slides queued up here. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Perfect. So I'm Jesse Proudman. I was the founder of a company called Blue Box. We were acquired by IBM just over a year ago, and now form the basis of the IBM Blue Box Private Cloud as a Service offering. You can follow me on Twitter at BlueBoxJesse. I like to start all of my conversations by talking about the IBM Cloud Vision, because I think it's helpful to frame where Blue Box fits into the broader portfolio of products that IBM sells. And so when we think about IBM's strategy, particularly as it relates to open cloud, at the end of the day, the customers that we're working with are focused on building solutions or delivering solutions. Those are either solutions externally to their end customers or used internally in their businesses. Those solutions run on software. That software is either built internally or delivered as a service. That software runs on a platform, and that platform has to run on an infrastructure. At IBM, we are big supporters of Cloud Foundry and Docker from a platform perspective, along with a host of a whole additional set of services. And then from an infrastructure perspective, we've chosen OpenStack to be our open cloud software of choice. The belief is that across those stacks, we then can deliver the notion of local, dedicated, or public clouds, where local and dedicated are your traditional private clouds. They're single-tenant implementations, with local being delivered on premises and dedicated being delivered in a SoftLayer data center, and public being delivered in a multi-tenant capacity. So OpenStack has been and will continue to be a big portion of IBM's strategy. If you go back to the creation of the OpenStack Foundation, IBM was one of the original participants in that process. In the Mitaka release that came out in April, we had more than 460,000 lines of code that were touched by various groups within IBM. We're one of the top 4 contributors in the last 5 releases. There's more than 212 dedicated developers across IBM working in multiple OpenStack projects. And across the aggregate IBM company, there's more than 500 employees working on OpenStack, whether it be from the code, product management, the products we sell, or working with the foundation directly. So this has been and continues to be a big part of IBM's strategy moving forward. So I want to talk a little bit about Blue Box and this notion of private cloud as a service and how that fits into the context that Al laid out previously. So as we've transitioned in the cloud journey over the last 6 or 7 years for most enterprises, you can go and ask anybody and they'll all say they want a cloud experience. Some go directly to public cloud for that, and some certainly are requesting and desiring a private cloud for that capability. For that private cloud implementation, as Al mentioned, some are looking at rolling their own or using distros, and I've done sort of some calculations on cost for those 2 paths. But we found that many of those customers end up very frustrated with that process, and Al laid out a lot of those reasons. Oftentimes it's velocity of the project, or shortage of skill sets, or just sort of the tool set nature of OpenStack, that it becomes very difficult to know which pieces do you want to incorporate into your offering. And so we found that many organizations have found a better way, and many enterprise buyers are looking to consume OpenStack without having to manage OpenStack. They want all the power of OpenStack without the pain of OpenStack. And that concept was really the basis of what we were trying to do when we went out and built Blue Box a number of years ago. So when we started this project, we looked at the market, we looked at public cloud, and we looked at private cloud, and we identified these 8 characteristics that we felt would be very important and beneficial to have in a private cloud as a service offering. From a public cloud perspective, obviously elasticity has been and continues to be a very important part of that experience. And so with Blue Box Dedicated, we wanted to make sure that we could deliver and scale up these environments very quickly. The OpEx billing model was an interesting approach for public cloud, and many organizations found that to be valuable, and so our dedicated offering, again, is billed in an OpEx capacity. Ease of use and time to implement. These were 2 characteristics that came up time and time again. Ease of use being the support of the tool sets that you have today. So configuration management tools like Chef, Puppet, or Ansible, or cloud management platforms like RightScale or Scalar. Ensuring that those types of technologies that organizations are using in their cloud journey today are compatible with the cloud that you select, the private cloud that you select, was really important. And then time to implement. How fast from the moment you decide to get going to the moment you have access to the API can you go? And in public cloud, that can be measured in a matter of minutes. And in most private cloud implementations, particularly do-it-yourself or distribution-based implementations, that's measured in weeks or months or quarters. And so our focus with Blue Box Dedicated was to make sure that we could shorten that down to a matter of days. From a private cloud perspective, data sovereignty was obviously a characteristic that many people found important. So being able to identify and isolate data to exactly the location that was important to you. So we're able to meet that both with our dedicated and our local offerings today, based on the geographic footprints that we have access to. Environmental controls, having a single administrative user or set of users that have visibility into what is going on in your cloud was very important. We heard horror stories from organizations who used public clouds only to have their engineers depart the company and take the access to the resources with them. And so ensuring that visibility into the cloud environment was key. Cost predictability was an important characteristic. So in public cloud environments, it's certainly pay per use, but the challenge is that there are now so many variables that you're paying for that To some extent, I like to joke that it takes a PhD to calculate what your bill will be 6, 9, or 12 months from now. With the Blue Box implementations, you're billed based on deployed capacity. And so it becomes much, much easier to understand the charges on your bill and how they will change over time. And then lastly, hybrid capability. And this means a couple things. First, being able to integrate multiple private clouds together to federate across a global footprint. Second, being able to integrate private cloud adjacent to your existing infrastructure. And then third, being able to integrate a dedicated cloud in SoftLayer with a local cloud in your data center. And so we wanted to make sure that we could execute on those 3 scenarios with Blue Box. And so as we built the offering, those were the characteristics that we held as tenets through the design and implementation, and now these are characteristics that are part of the offering in market today. So what is Blue Box Cloud, and where does it fit in the actual product offerings of the broader IBM portfolio? So Blue Box Cloud, again, it's a private cloud as a service, and it's offered in 2 flavors, a dedicated flavor and a local flavor. Dedicated is an off-premises implementation that sits in any of SoftLayer's global data centers, and local is an on-premises remotely managed implementation that sits in any data center of the customer's selection. The Blue Box offering delivers a full OpenStack experience, so a customer gets back an API, an SLA, and that cloud experience. And then it provides them the ability to put a whole set of additional software on top. So cloud management, like Cloudsoft AMP, platform as a service offerings, like Bluemix, or their own direct workloads can talk directly to those APIs. The interesting thing between dedicated and local is that at the end of the day, they are, for all intents and purposes, the same product. We use the same code base, the same OpenStack services, the same operational team to support both dedicated and local. And so the experience that a customer gets, whether it's on premises or in a SoftLayer facility, is identical. And that helps many organizations that are trying to really implement that hybrid capability between multiple implementations. It makes it a more functional and easy experience. As mentioned, dedicated is a pure OpEx model. You're paying 1 monthly fee, and that covers all of the server infrastructure and all of the OpenStack capabilities. And Blue Box manages all of the upgrades, the management, the monitoring of OpenStack itself. Local is a combination of OpEx and CapEx. The physical infrastructure is purchased on a CapEx basis, and then the operational fees are paid on an OpEx basis. And as mentioned, can be deployed in any data center. I think IBM is one of the most unique companies involved in the cloud ecosystem today based on our global points of presence. And actually now this map is out of date because we just released 2 additional new data centers in the Nordic countries. And that's the power of what we're able to do, and actually Korea as well. It's the power we're able to do is being part of IBM. So as IBM and SoftLayer bring additional data centers online around the globe, the Blue Box offering is available in those sites. And it really helps organizations, particularly in Europe and Asia, that are interested in data sovereignty and in data isolation from a geographic perspective. So in closing, IBM Blue Box is a proven OpenStack deployment. We are a proven OpenStack contributor and community member. We have hundreds of these implementations in field today that have been running for years. So we have a ton of experience with this product, with OpenStack, with the upgrade cycle, with the operational burden that is OpenStack itself. We found that through that experience, customers do gain immense value from hybrid cloud. These private cloud implementations, whether they be dedicated or local, can integrate with their existing data sets and data centers, and really provide a next generation infrastructure for organizations to write applications to. The challenge for most of these companies is that they've tried to do this OpenStack experience on their own, and that has proven to be very frustrating and challenging. And they just want to work with OpenStack, not on OpenStack. And so we believe that IBM Blue Box really solves that challenge for these users. We deliver that in a global capacity, and it's available today. So with that, I believe I will hand it over to Duncan, who will talk about what Cloudsoft has been doing with the Blue Box offerings.
Excellent.
Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you.
So before I start, I just a couple of remarks, really arising out of what Al and Jesse have said collectively. And this is hot off the press from a meeting I attended yesterday at JP Morgan. They do an annual technology innovation symposium. And their global CIO, Dan Adesi, stood up and said, we are now open source first. That is our philosophy through and through. He also said, we're committed to hybrid. And then the most interesting thing, I think, from the point of view of all of us, is he then said, and we have 18,000 developers, and so it's great having a cloud or a hybrid cloud strategy, but how do you actually get your developers to be more productive in that world? And it's a world of either cloud-rich or cloud-first applications. So obviously, like any or many of the large enterprises and banks are no different. There's a huge amount of existing applications, many of which are core to the business. But I think it was really interesting listening to him and his keynote, and that message is coming really from the top down, because he is the global CIO, not just CIO for one of the lines of business within JP Morgan, which of course has not quite as many employees as IBM, but probably about half that number. But it's worth bearing that in mind, because ultimately, whether it's Blue Box, whether it's Cloudsoft, it's our job to fundamentally ensure that companies like JP Morgan, and obviously smaller companies too, can be as productive as possible and can really focus on delivering solutions that make a difference to their business. So I always like to think of that before I then, as a lapsed CTO, probably disappear into the weeds and get too technical. So I'll try to avoid that fate. But it's always healthy, I think, to remind ourselves of why we're doing all this. So first, since we're relatively young company, just one slide on who we are. We are, without doubt, the leading hybrid cloud application management company at this stage. What does that mean? It means that we can help you model, but not just model in the sense of a design time, but then deploy and manage any application on any cloud or across many clouds. And today we're going to focus on the work we've been doing with Blue Box and how we've leveraged their particular offering. Because, as Jesse said, we want to be a consumer of OpenStack ourselves. I mean, we're no different in that sense, rather than somebody who has to worry about actually standing up OpenStack. We have a team that's, we're headquartered in Edinburgh, but we now have a team that, started out in Europe, but now we have points of presence in North America and Asia Pacific. And probably our main claim to fame, and something we've been working on for over 5 years now, is what's now known as the Apache Brooklyn open source project. So that really is the foundation of everything I'm going to talk about. So we have a commercially available offering called the Cloudsoft Application Management Platform, AMP for short. But it's important to note that that is built on exactly the same code base as anybody would use if they went and used the Apache Brooklyn open source project. So we guarantee fidelity that any blueprint you create in AMP will run in Brooklyn and vice versa. The way in which Brooklyn itself is built at runtime is it's founded on the core concept of autonomic computing. And myself, my co-founder and CTO, Alex Henneveld, our VP of Engineering, Aled Sage, have a great deal of experience in the autonomic computing field. And essentially, at the heart of that, it's all about closed-loop management, automation. So automation comes in many different forms, of course, but in our world, it's about understanding what's happening within an application or within the environment in which that application is running, and having the ability to then react to that information, that sense data, and affect or change that application. So maintain its health, maintain its SLA, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really Cloudsoft in a nutshell. So I've alluded to this before, but let's just focus on what exactly we mean by model, deploy, and manage. So a model for us is a blueprint that is completely independent of assumptions about the underlying infrastructure. So there's no hard wiring of AMIs or any other low-level infrastructure information. We're working on this top-down. The blueprints that we create or that you can create with our tool are based on the OASIS CAMP specification. So I'm sure a lot of people have heard of Tosca, maybe less people have heard about CAMP. Tosca, in our view, has run its course. It's great if you're an infrastructure person, but it works bottom up, where CAMP has always set out its tool by saying we want to work top down, we want to think about the application, its needs, describe the structure of that application in a way that does not get prescriptive and does not tell the infrastructure how to do what it needs to do, but instead focuses on really the relationships between components within an application, dependencies that may exist, and more importantly, what policies, what best practices from a management perspective do you want to capture in that blueprint. So that model you can think of if you're a programmer as being essentially a class. So when we take that model and instantiate it, we obviously get in object-oriented terms an instance of that class. What does that mean? Well, that means that we've actually deployed that blueprint in a particular environment on a particular day. And so the location that's been chosen may vary, but just as with the blueprint for a house, you can build a house on many different terrains, and so it is with AMP, that we can do whatever is needed in terms of course correction to ensure your blueprint is consistent and runs across many different environments. So once you've deployed it, we then have a live version of that same blueprint, that same model. And what we can then do is instrument that. And not all the instrumentation comes necessarily from within AMP itself. We can take instrumentation from various monitoring sources, from the underlying infrastructure, and so on and so forth. But the key is using that information intelligently to then manage the application. And so when we say manage, we mean throughout its lifetime. So sometimes this is called in-life management or day 2, day end management. But the idea is that you're not just deploying something and then walking away. You're ensuring that you can maintain all of the SLAs associated with that application on an ongoing basis. And so that closed loop sense and effect or change the environment is critical to be able to do that at scale. So, there are a number of different scenarios that one can look at in this context. So it might simply be a case of scale out or scale up. It might be follow the sun, follow the moon, or it might be, and this came up in the conversation earlier, it may be about ensuring that you don't breach any governance and compliance regulations for your application. So make sure it doesn't run in certain places. Ensure that it you are maintaining data residency, whatever. So that's fundamentally what we give you the ability to do on a consistent basis and do it once. So design or develop that blueprint once and then use it in any number of different combinations. So before, excuse me, before diving into the detail, let's also step back and look at what we see very often as typical use cases. And it's interesting, and I'm going to digress here, but I was at a 451 conference a couple of days ago, and William Fellows, and I think Al, it might have been the voice of the enterprise, or certainly research in that area. 451 had done some research on, typically what are people doing with cloud? And I have to say the result somewhat surprised me in that essentially the correspondents or respondents said approximately 1/3 of the applications we're developing for cloud are net new applications. So that's using cloud really, or a cloud first strategy to innovate using cloud. But at the same time, a further third were saying, well, actually, we're just migrating our existing applications to the cloud. And then the final third was, we're actually modernizing or re-architecting for cloud. So when people talk about migration, really we're talking about two things. It's either taking an existing application and deploying that in a cloudy environment, or it's actually taking an opportunity to actually refactor that application, unpack and understand its structure, create a blueprint for that, and then make it better managed as a result. So that covers migration, modernization, and innovation. But a very interesting use case that's emerged more recently is consolidation, where what you're actually doing, and we have a horse in this race, what you're actually doing is you're using, say, Cloud Foundry as your opinionated PaaS. You're developing applications, so you're very much in that innovative cloud-first mode. But at the same time, you need to reach back into your existing enterprise to access existing enterprise data. That data is highly valuable, and you're not allowed to simply copy it, nor should you just arbitrarily copy it everywhere. So instead, you need a principled way of actually reaching back and accessing that information. And so we do that through an integration with Cloud Foundry we call the Cloudsoft Service Broker. If you're familiar with Cloud Foundry, there is a Service Broker API that typically is used as a one-to-one mapping between a service being presented in the marketplace to a developer and a back-end service being stood up by somebody. In our case, the integration is with Apache Brooklyn / AMP, and so what that means is it's a one-to-many relationship. So that same API will allow us, through the operations view, to set up any number of different services and make those available to developers in particular organizations or spaces. So I know this is talking about concepts that are really around Cloud Foundry, but in simple terms, it means we're actually guaranteeing that we have full control over who can access what, who can see what data, who can stand up new services, and so on. So consolidation is a very interesting area and one that we see as being very much a way of using the cloud-first tools, but also exploiting your existing data sets and so on and so forth. So I'm a bit of a sucker for animations, so I just thought I'd sort of hammer home this point, looking at it from 3 points of view. So first, we've already discussed this notion of blueprints being consistent. So the idea is those blueprints, and here we've given some examples from our catalog, will allow you to actually take the same blueprint and deploy it on everything from, and no kidding, everything from physical through virtual to private or public cloud. And so obviously under the covers, we have to do some heavy lifting on your behalf, but that's the whole point of having something like Cloudsoft AMP or Apache Brooklyn in the mix, is in order to ensure that you, from the point of view of the person developing solutions, can ensure those solutions run consistently across many different environments, or indeed span different environments. And it's the same message that Jesse talked about earlier. We don't really want you to have to get to the weeds any more than he wants you to get to the weeds of OpenStack. Instead, we want to give you the best and most effective way of utilizing your time, your experience, your expertise, which is developing solutions for your business. So continuing this theme, in the case of the integration with something like Bluemix or Cloud Foundry, there are a number of companies now offering Cloud Foundry certified, or are deemed Cloud Foundry certified providers, I should say. So there's the numbers growing all the time. I think we're up to sort of 8 or 9 companies, all of whom are offering what Cloud Foundry Foundation certifies being a standard set of functionality around Cloud Foundry. So from our point of view, what does that mean? It means that you as a consumer of Cloud Foundry, you're not locked into a specific flavor of Cloud Foundry from one of the vendors, and you can guarantee that the functionality we provide will operate across any of the CF certified providers. So other examples besides IBM are people like Atos. So they recently announced at the last Cloud Foundry Summit in Santa Clara that they are now a CF certified provider of Cloud Foundry. You'll see Swisscom in there, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea is, I want to be able to reach back and access existing data services, but again, at the same time, provide those to the Cloud Foundry developer in a Cloud Foundry idiomatic way. So from their point of view, these services just show up in their marketplace and are available to them, but the operational sort of setup of all of that is done by the administrator of the Cloud Foundry environment. And it's not just about reaching back to existing services. Of course, we can present the Cloudsoft AMP catalog or elements from that catalog as plans in Cloud Foundry as well. Not content with working with Cloud Foundry, we've done a lot of work. Some of you may have heard of a project called Clocker that we started a couple of years ago, which we tongue-in-cheek called the Docker Cloud Maker, something we were allowed to do apart from when we were actually at DockerCon, and the lawyers told us we had to change our marketing. So such is the world we live in. But the idea here is that, and by the way, now we support not just Docker, but Kubernetes, etc., Mesos. The idea here is that, we're in the business of building blueprints to deploy software. Well, guess what? Docker is software, Kubernetes is software, Mesos is software. And again, we want to be able to create, and in this example, we'll focus on really the blueprint for deploying and then proactively managing on your behalf a Docker swarm in whichever environment you want it to be run for you. But the idea is, think of this as colonizing some part of the world, be it physical, virtual, or cloud, and setting it up so that now it's a Docker cluster, or it's a Kubernetes cluster, or indeed multiple clusters across multiple locations, because of course that's one of the value adds we bring, that we can create richer environments for you. But the idea is, once you've done that, and this is really, really important, that the blueprints that you have worked on before should now run in that environment. And so we will do everything as before to ensure that the blueprints you have today can also be run in a containerized world. We can also give you the endpoint for the Docker or Kubernetes cluster, and you can play with that to your heart's content. So we can both stand up and manage the cluster, and also, from our point of view, reuse existing blueprints and deploy them to that cluster. So now let's get into some of the specifics of why we elected to partner with Blue Box. So it will come as no surprise that customers were asking us for advice on OpenStack and our support for that. And of course, we supported OpenStack from very early on through our work with Apache JClouds. So other than AWS, OpenStack was one of the early cloud environments that they supported, or virtualization environments that they supported. Now, of course, the basis of the Blue Box cloud. We'd worked prior to Blue Box with SoftLayer, so we had a lot of experience of targeting SoftLayer. So the SoftLayer cloud comes in various flavors, and we were able to target all of those. What we found fascinating was the notion of Blue Box running in SoftLayer data centers, as Jesse pointed out, but also being able to sort of tap into the underlying network that SoftLayer provides. And so it's not just about the operational excellence of Blue Box, the fact that they could stand up private cloud for us, and I think we were the first user of SoftLayer, of Blue Box on SoftLayer, but they got that up and running very quickly. I say less than 2 weeks now. It's almost you can get this stuff almost on demand. But that was the initial engagement model with them, was being one of the sort of pioneers of using Blue Box within the context of the SoftLayer environment. But subsequently, we've now got 3 clusters running, one in San Jose, one in London, one in Singapore. But for us, the real interest was then working with, not just being a customer of Blue Box, but working with them to ensure that we could expose the networking that SoftLayer has. So one of their real value adds, in my opinion, and I'm a bit of a broken record when it comes to this, is this private network that connects all of the SoftLayer data centers worldwide. So what the Blue Box team did was expose that capability through the OpenStack APIs. So it's completely vanilla. The experience we get is the standard OpenStack experience, with the exception that they'll present a shared private network, which will allow us to then connect virtual machines across the globe using this private network. And we've used that to great effect with running a deployment of the Hyperledger blockchain network across our three locations. And so we'll make sure that when we send out the details for the recording, that we provide you with information on that. But the bottom line is that this allows you to choose when or if you want to go out over the internet versus leverage their private network. And in many cases, for many use cases for enterprise, the ability to run across multiple locations, and obviously we've chosen 3, but there's now 50+ locations where one can run Blue Box, not to mention the on-prem or local option as well, of course. But the idea here is that you can deploy a blueprint that spans multiple locations, that deploys your application or solution, whether it's the blockchain network or it's something like the Basho enterprise flavor of React, where you've got the multi-cluster replication, which again, typically you'll run over multiple locations. But the idea is that you've got this fully meshed private network underpinning all of this. And to us, that is a massive value add for the kind of customers and use cases that we're dealing with. So in summary, and I'm conscious of time here, just very, very briefly, the way we see ourselves fitting is we can actually help you as a customer exploit cloud, whether it's, in the case of Blue Box, dedicated or local, or if you want to move beyond that into the public cloud. And again, obviously that's not just IBM, but it can be Amazon, Azure, Google, etc. We also have integrations with people like Dimension Data, CenturyLink, etc. So we're agnostic about the underlying environment. We'll make sure that that environment suits you and your purposes, and the blueprints will run in that environment. So in closing, same message really, that IBM, through its cloud open by design strategy, we see this as offering you as a customer choice with consistency. So if you're familiar with Bluemix, you get a consistent user experience through that. We are undoubtedly uniquely placed to exploit the global footprint now available through Blue Box. We can create blueprints that target many of those locations. And our real value add is whenever you want to do something that's remotely complex. I mean, by all means, if your application can sit in an image in Bitnami, go knock yourself out. But there are many applications that don't fit that model, where the ability to build blueprints in a cloud agnostic way is hugely valuable. I've given some examples here. There are many examples, whether they're from IBM and their own solution set, or customer or partners, where this technique, this technology, this combination, really the joint value proposition of Cloudsoft AMP and Blue Box, has a huge amount of value to offer you. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to skip the last slide and hand back to Ross.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Duncan. I have collated the questions, so let me just fire right into those. Al, one for you, please. In your view, is the future of OpenStack assured, or are there still risks?
I will I'm not sure what the ultimate future holds, but clearly OpenStack has enterprise mindshare, but there's still some concerns, as I had mentioned. And if the community at large is able to address things like the platform's ability to provide scalability and provide security and make the upgrade process from release to release less onerous, then it has greater staying power, providing the hybrid integration with the existing hyperscale platforms as well will ultimately help its success long term as well.
Thank you. And this next one certainly might relate to some of the kind of considerations around scale. I just wonder how much of the OpenStack market growth do you expect to be attributable to NFV, network function virtualization?
I guess that's for me as well. Yeah, so NFV is one of the promising use cases, and there's a number of telcos that are adopting OpenStack for that. I think AT&T, for example, I think announced like 70 different nodes on the globe that are being run by OpenStack. But the overall market size that we're tracking, the majority of revenue is still over time with service providers. So those offering either a public or private cloud, including IBM Blue Box. That's the majority of revenue, even through the 2020 metrics that we're tracking. And the next largest is from the distribution providers. So perhaps some of them are being sold to enterprises or telcos that are building NFV, but service providers is still the predominant source of revenue amongst the OpenStack community over time.
Excellent, thank you for that. I think these next one's probably best for Jesse. So Jesse, how do you manage Blue Box Local in practice?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the Blue Box Local implementation is connected back to the IBM operations team. And so all of the same monitoring, telemetry, logging capabilities that we use to run our dedicated offerings work exactly the same for the local product. So it is a connected offering back to IBM. So in some scenarios that is not a viable option, but we found that methodology really allows us to provide the best experience to the customer.
Great, thank you. And what's your view on Kubernetes running OpenStack?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting experiment, and certainly one that is showing promise. We've dabbled with the containerization of certain OpenStack components in the past, and have experienced challenges with sort of the functionality of the container ecosystem and how it implements itself with OpenStack. Certainly, I think as time goes on, at the end of the day, OpenStack is in itself a distributed application, and so that methodology may work. It's not an area that we found worthwhile to invest a ton of our energy in at the moment, though. We think there are alternatives in the ecosystem that allow you to do much of that capability without the complexity of adding another tool.
Thank you. Duncan, conscious of time, but there's a couple that I think are best for you. One is AMP a tool for developers or operators? And the other one is, what advice would you give people who want to move their legacy applications to the cloud?
I'll answer the last one first. Talk to us.
Okay.
I mean, joking aside, that's very hard to unpack in 30 seconds or less. But I think, the one thing I would say, whether it's working with us or working with anybody else, is take the time to understand your existing application real estate. Avoid the temptation just to do lift and shift, which is a horrible, horrible solution. And instead, even if it takes a while to discover, because in some cases these applications are fairly gnarly, but understand their structure, the dependencies, all the stuff we then would put into a blueprint if you were using us, because that actually oftentimes teaches you a great deal about the application and gives you insight into the likely challenges you're going to face, and in many cases, there are off-the-shelf policies that we have that can help you with really that sort of process of migrating or modernizing, perhaps is a better word, those applications. And of course, there will be some applications that you probably want to put to the bottom of that list. So, we don't see, and again, this was something that came out in that symposium yesterday, not every application is going to be moved to the cloud, nor should it be. And so things like reach back become important if you're managing large enterprise data sets. You're not going to arbitrarily move them into a cloud, for heaven's sake. So I think, it's really taking the time and the trouble to understand your application landscape. And the other question, AMP is ultimately a platform. So there's a runtime element where we want to give an operator or an operational view of the applications that are running. But of course, at design time, it's something that we'd very much encourage developers to think about as they're developing applications. Always think about how that application is going to be implemented, and alongside any of the development, start creating those blueprints. So I think it's something that speaks to both users who simply want to consume solutions, developers who want to build blueprints, and finally the operators that want to actually have better visibility into what's going on and far greater sort of ability to control or change the environment.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. Thank you everyone for participating and your questions. And yeah, thanks to 451 Research and IBM for help with the session. We are going to publish a recording of this webinar on the Cloudsoft YouTube channel. Once it's up, we will put it there, and also you can sign up via cloudsoft.io. Any other questions, please reach out to us however you like. Twitter is one way. And yeah, thank you everyone very much, and goodbye.